There was a moment at Reach Falls yesterday with Pam that felt like a perfect metaphor for so much of my life over the last few years that I laughed when I realized it. We were standing there looking at this waterfall that was absolutely beautiful yet raging as it crashed down into the water below with so much force that both of us immediately had the same thought, which was that this might actually hurt a little bit if we decide to walk underneath it with this guide. Because there's a huge difference between admiring a waterfall from a distance and willingly placing yourself directly beneath hundreds or thousands of pounds of rushing water coming from above. So as we stood there watching the water pound against the rocks, we kind of looked at each other with that combination of excitement and hesitation that usually shows up right before you do something you know is either going to become an incredible memory or an awful idea. And honestly, we were not entirely sure which one it was going to be. So the closer we got, the louder the water sounded and the more powerful it looked. And I think both of us were quietly wondering whether we were about to get completely beat down and pummeled by this waterfall and come out on the other side questioning every decision that had led us to that exact moment in time. Then I said what we were both thinking anyway, which was, why not? So we did it. We walked underneath that raging waterfall with the guide while laughing and screaming and cheering each other on, bracing ourselves for impact. And somewhere in the middle of all that rushing water, nervous energy and excitement, I felt something that has become very familiar to me over the years, which is the feeling of fear standing right beside something beautiful. The truth is that when I look back over my life, almost every wonderful thing that has happened to me arrived wearing fear first. Leaving behind my life in Las Vegas and coming to Jamaica was terrifying in ways that I cannot explain to people who have never walked away from an entire life that they spent years building. Because there is something very incredibly unsettling about voluntarily stepping away from familiarity and certainty and routine and choosing instead to trust yourself enough to walk towards something that you can't fully see yet. There were so many moments I questioned myself. There were moments where other people questioned me. And I wondered whether I was making the biggest mistake of my life by walking away from everything that was familiar and comfortable and predictable in exchange for something that existed as a feeling in my heart and a vision in my mind. What I now know is that if I had waited until I was no longer afraid, I probably would have never left. I would still be sitting in the same place, waiting for courage to arrive first, not realizing that courage shows up after you take the first step, not before. So I moved while I was afraid. I started over while I was afraid. I built a new life while I was afraid. And I trusted myself while I was afraid, not to mention unwell. On the other side of that fear was a freedom that I had not even allowed myself to imagine before it became a reality. Now I find myself living in the hills of Portland, Jamaica, taking guests to rivers and waterfalls and hidden gems while sharing experiences that remind all of us that life is meant to be lived and not simply managed. As I watched Pam experience these moments and embrace these adventures and say yes to things that she maybe would not normally say yes to back home and do so many firsts, I found myself feeling so grateful that I get to be a part of creating experiences that remind women that there are other ways to live and other ways to move through the world. Somewhere along the way, so many women learn that life is supposed to become smaller as we age, that adventure belongs to the young, that reinvention has an expiration date, and that eventually our roles become simply surviving our schedules and responsibilities while squeezing joy into whatever small spaces remain, and I reject that completely. I believe there are women all over the world who are waiting for permission to become curious and adventurous again and playful, not realizing that permission was never required. There are women who have spent so much time taking care of everyone else that they have forgotten what it feels like to choose themselves and their happiness and their peace and their freedom. And there are women who know deep down that there is another version of life available to them if they're willing to get uncomfortable long enough to reach for it. For me, that looked like leaving Las Vegas and building a life here in Jamaica. For Pam, maybe it looked like standing underneath a raging waterfall while laughing through the fear and going through Jamaica doing a lot of firsts for the first time, being guided by once a stranger, now a friend. For someone else, it may look completely different because freedom doesn't come in one shape. What freedom does ask of us, however, is to move toward the things that call us. As I stood underneath the waterfall with the water crashing all around me, I was reminded that fear is not always a warning sign to tell us to stop. It's something that is telling us to go. So now I want to ask all of you something because I genuinely want to know the answer. What is one thing that fear has been talking you out of doing that your heart has been begging you to do anyway? I'd love to know. Thank you for listening. Love, health, and wealth. Peace.